Hello, friend. Welcome. I'm really glad you're here. Just go ahead, get comfortable, and let yourself unwind. And let the day go, for just a little while. Everyone knows Merlin. The wizard, the long white beard, the boy who would be king. We've known him since before we can remember being told about him. And that's exactly what pulled me into this one. Because when I went looking for where he actually came from, I found no wand, and no crystal cave, and no tower. I found someone far older, and far sadder, and far more human than the wizard. And the road from that man to the Merlin we all know is one of the strangest a story has ever travelled. So tonight, we're going to walk that road. We'll start in an old world where whole libraries lived in the trained memory of poets. We'll meet the medieval writer who gathered the scraps and dreamed the wizard into being. And we'll follow the name as it grows, century by century, into the most famous magician who ever lived. And as we go, I'll be honest with you about which parts of this story are solid ground, which parts the scholars still argue over, which parts became pure legend, and why this legend, of all of them, refused to die. So settle in, and let me take you back. There are names that outlast the people who wore them, and travel so far from home that the people themselves are lost along the way. This is the story of one of those names. It has crossed 14 centuries and most of a world, and it belonged, if it belonged to any single man at all, to someone we can now barely see. Long before there were many books in Britain, there were poets. In the old Welsh world, memory was not kept on paper, but in the trained minds of men who could hold a lineage, a battle, and a prophecy in their heads, and give them back, years later, almost unchanged. A people who had not yet taken up writing remembered anyway, carefully, and out loud. And among the things they kept was the memory of a man who had walked into a forest and lost his reason there. It is worth pausing, at the start, on those poets, because they are the ground the whole story grows from. A trained Welsh bard was not a casual singer. He was a kind of living library, apprenticed for years, made to learn by heart the genealogies of the great families, the praise of the dead, the meters and the old measures, and the prophecies that told a beaten people they would one day have their island back. His memory was the archive. When he recited, he was not performing so much as consulting the record, and the record was kept in his own head, passed from an older man to a younger one across a lifetime, hand to hand, voice to voice. Nothing in it was fixed the way ink is fixed. Everything in it was alive, and could grow, and did. In those old songs, the name we are following was not Merlin. It was Myrddin. And he was not, in the earliest of them, a wizard at all. There is no wand in the early poems, no crystal cave, no tower, no boy waiting to be made a king. There is only a man among apple trees, speaking to them, because there is no longer anyone else to speak to. The poems that carry his voice are strange and beautiful and hard to date, and they do not tell a story so much as overhear a mind. In one, he addresses an apple tree, a sweet apple tree growing in a clearing, and counts himself among the hunted. He is hidden under it, he says, from the men who want him, for so long that he has learned its every branch. In another, he speaks to a small pig, a little pig rooting beside him in the dark, and tells it, plainly, without drama, that he is afraid. He is afraid of a certain king's horseman, of Rhydderch the generous and his swift hounds. He is afraid of the coming winter, of the snow that will find him with no roof and no fire. And he is afraid, most of all, and most quietly, of his own thoughts, which will not leave him alone in the wood. He says he has lived like this for 50 years, 50 winters, out under the trees, ever since the day of the battle. And here is the strange thing, the thing that makes this more than a fairy tale. The battle appears to be real. In a set of old annals, the spare kind that give a year, a single line and nothing else, there is an entry that historians are willing, more or less, to trust. In the year we would now call 573, it records, "A battle was fought at a place called Arfderydd." There is not much more than that. The annals do not describe the field, or the weather, or the fear. They give the year and the name of the place and move on, the way such records do, indifferent to everything a poet would want to know. But men died there. A lord named Gwendolew, whom the poems name as Myrddin's own lord, the man he served, fell among them. And somewhere in the ruin of that day, if the songs are to be believed, a man who had loved that lord turned away from the company of other people and did not come back. What broke in him, the poems do not exactly say. Grief, perhaps, or the particular horror of having survived when the man he served did not. Or something older and stranger, a mind that had always been near the edge and went over it on that one day. The old word for what happened to him carried both meanings at once, the wildness of the madman and the wildness of the wood, as though to lose your reason and to vanish into the trees were, in the end, the same act. Myrddin Wilt, later ages would call him, Myrddin the Wild. Everything else, the magic, the king, the fame that would one day belong to that name, was still 500 years away. For now, there was only the forest and the apple trees and the pig in the dark, and a grief that the old poets, for reasons of their own, chose to keep and to carry, generation after generation, long after anyone could have told you who exactly the man had been. For a long time, all of it stayed where it had begun, in the mouths of Welsh poets, in a language most of the world would never learn, sung and re-sung in halls that have since fallen into the grass. The man in the forest was a local grief, a northern memory, precise and small, kept by the one people who had reason to keep it. What made him large was writing, and writing came slowly to Britain, and when it came, it did not come at first to praise a mad bard. It came, as it so often did, to explain a kingdom to itself. Around the year 828, in a monastery whose exact walls we can no longer point to, a man we call Nennius gathered up what he could find of the island's past and set it down in Latin. He was honest, in his way, about his method. He said he had made a heap of all that he had found, which is the kind of line a modern historian reads with a smile and a sigh, because a heap is exactly what it is: old, bright things and broken things piled together without much thought for which was which. Into that heap went genealogies and battles and the wreckage of older stories half remembered, and among them, a tale about a king named Vortigern and a tower that would not stand. The tale ran like this in the old book. Vortigern was a British king in a bad season, a man who had, in the way of the story, invited the Saxons in to help him, and then found he could not get them out again. Hunted by his own bad decisions, he tried to raise a stronghold for himself in the mountains of Wales, a last safe place high in the rock. But each night the stones and the timbers his men set up by day sank into the ground and vanished, so that each morning they began again on bare earth, as though the hill itself refused the building. His wise men gave him the remedy such men always gave. They told him the foundation wanted blood, that he must find a boy who had been born without a father, and kill him, and sprinkle the boy's blood on the stones. The king's men searched, and in a far town they found such a boy, whose mother, a woman of good family, swore she had never known any man, and could not explain her son. They brought him to the mountain to die. But the boy, standing among the men who had come to kill him, was cleverer than all of them together. He asked the king's wise men what lay beneath the foundation, and they did not know, and could not say. He told them, a pool hidden under the ground. They dug and found it exactly where he had said. He told them there were 2 hollow stones at the bottom of the pool, and within the stones 2 sleeping things. They drained the water and broke the stones, and out came 2 dragons, one red and one white, that had been asleep down there in the dark, and that woke now and fought. It was not a small fight. The white dragon drove the red one back across the ground and back, and it seemed the red one must be finished, and then the red one turned and gathered itself and drove the white one back the way it had come, and the 2 of them went on like that, losing and winning and losing, while the king and his men stood silent and watched. And the fatherless boy explained to the silent hall what they were seeing. The red dragon, he said, was the people of Britain, the old people of the island. The white dragon was the Saxons, the newcomers, who were taking the land field by field. The struggle in the pool was the struggle of the age, the thing everyone in that hall was living inside, and no one had dared to say plainly. And for now, the boy said, the white dragon had the better of it, but not forever. There was no wand in any of it. There was no wizard in the sense we would later mean the word. No robe stitched with stars, no tower of his own, no long white beard, no staff. There was a frightened, fatherless child who turned out to see, more clearly than the men who had meant to kill him, the shape of the danger they were all in. And there was, already, the one thing that would fasten itself to this figure forever and never let go. Prophecy. Not magic, exactly. Sight. The gift of saying, plainly and ahead of time, the thing the powerful did not want to hear, and being right. In Nennius, the boy is not even called Merlin. He is called Ambrosius. The name Merlin had not yet been attached to him, and would not be, for 300 more years. So there were 2 prophets now, waiting in the record, in 2 different traditions, in 2 different corners of the island. There was Myrddin, the wild man of the northern poems, grieving in his forest, talking to the trees and the pig. And there was Ambrosius, the fatherless boy of the Welsh mountains, reading the dragons under the tower. Neither of them was Merlin. Neither of them had ever heard the name. They were 2 separate memories, kept by 2 separate peoples, for 2 separate reasons, and there was, as yet, no earthly reason for them to become one man. That reason, when it finally came, was not a battle, or a discovery, or a grave dug up. It was a single writer, 300 years further on, with a gift for telling a story so well that people would take it for history for the better part of 1,000 years. The writer was Geoffrey of Monmouth, and if you have kept me company before, on the night we walked out to Stonehenge, you have already met him, for his is the same pen that gave the great stones their giants. He worked at Oxford in the 12th century, a churchman by training, though what he plainly loved was not scripture, but the deep, half-lost past of Britain, the age of its old kings before the Saxons and the Normans came. It was a good time to love that past. The Normans, new masters of England, were hungry for the island's older story, and a man who could supply it and make it grand would find an eager audience. Around the year 1130, Geoffrey did an odd thing, a kind of trial run. He published, on its own, a small book of prophecies, and he put them in the mouth of a figure he called Merlin. The prophecies were strange and dark and grand, kingdoms rising and falling, beasts and floods and stars, boars and lions and dragons, the kind of thing that could be pointed at almost any event and made to fit. They were popular at once, and copied and argued over, and taken seriously by serious men. Where his Merlin came from is the question at the centre of everything. Geoffrey, it seems, had reached back into the Welsh material, into the Myrddin of the northern poems, the mad prophet in the wood, and had also taken up the fatherless boy from Nennius, the one who read the dragons, and he had quietly folded the two together, the wild prophet and the child prophet, into a single man. Two figures, two traditions, 5 centuries and 100 miles apart, joined with a stroke of the pen into one, and given a new name to wear. He even, so a later scholar guessed, changed the spelling on purpose. The Welsh name Myrddin, carried straight into Latin, would have come out close to a word in the French of his readers that no one wanted attached to a hero, an ugly, low word, a barnyard word, and so, to save his wizard from a snicker, Geoffrey wrote not Myrddinus, but Merlinus. It is only a guess. It is also the kind of small, human, faintly ridiculous choice that has a way of being true. 6 years or so after the prophecies, Geoffrey finished the work that would carry the name across the world. He called it A History of the Kings of Britain, and he presented it, straight-faced, as sober fact, a true chronicle, drawn, he said, from a very old book in the British tongue that a friend had given him, that he alone had seen, and that no one, from that day to this, has ever found. It is one of the great quiet frauds of the Middle Ages, and it worked completely. Into that book, Geoffrey poured a line of kings stretching all the way back to the fall of Troy, a whole invented dynasty, splendid and detailed and mostly imaginary, and among them, near its heart, Arthur. And standing beside the making of Arthur, guiding it, arranging it, foreseeing it, Merlin. It is difficult now to convey how completely this book was believed. It was copied by hand, and then copied again and again. Something like 200 handwritten copies of it survive even now, which for the age is an enormous number, the mark of a genuine sensation, a book everyone who could read wanted to have. It was turned out of Latin into French, and into English, and in time back into Welsh, the language its half-buried sources had come from. For centuries, not years, centuries, serious men opened it to learn what had truly happened in the island's youth, and taught it, and built on it, and quarrelled with anyone who doubted it. And so, a figure stitched together in a single study at Oxford, out of 2 old poems and a monk's untidy heap of memory, walked out into the world wearing the clothes of fact, and was received, nearly everywhere, as a real man who had really lived, and really stood at the shoulder of a real king. Not quite everyone was fooled. There was a sharp Welsh churchman named Gerald, who travelled and wrote and noticed things, and who noticed, among other things, a problem with Merlin, a seam in the cloth. There seemed to be, Gerald observed, 2 of him. One Merlin belonged to the time of Vortigern and Arthur, the prophet of the dragons and the king. But there was another Merlin in the traditions, a later one, a wild man of the northern woods who had gone mad after a battle and lived among the beasts. And the 2 could not easily be the same, for they lived generations apart. Gerald was, in his rough way, exactly right. He had caught Geoffrey in the act. He had noticed the join where 2 men had been made into one, and had pulled, gently, at the thread. But it did not matter. The seam held, because the story was too good and too grand and too useful to come apart over a scholar's careful footnote. The single Merlin had already left the study and the library and gone out among ordinary people, and there is no calling a name like that back. There is one more thing worth knowing about Geoffrey, because it is the strangest and the most human. Late in his life, years after the great history had made his wizard famous, he wrote one final book about him, a long poem called The Life of Merlin, and in it, Merlin goes back to being, of all the things he had become, the wild man in the forest. Mad with grief after a battle, talking to the trees, fleeing the company of men, counting the winters, watching the stars. It is as though the older, sadder, truer figure had quietly reasserted himself under all the grandeur that Geoffrey had draped on him. As though the man in the wood, the real ground of the whole thing, had never entirely let go, and had reached up at the end, through the writer who had half buried him, and asked to be remembered as he had begun. Once the name was loose in the world did to it what the world does to any good empty vessel. It filled it. Every age that received Merlin added something of its own, and hung the new thing on the old name, and passed it along a little heavier than it had come. Some of those additions were already there in Geoffrey. Others arrived centuries after him, from other countries and other hands, from writers who had never been near Wales. And it is worth, even now, keeping them apart and knowing which is which, because the keeping apart is the only honest way to hold a legend grown this large. In Geoffrey's history, Merlin moved a ring of enormous stones. The story went that a British king wished to raise a fitting monument over the graves of noblemen who had been murdered at a peace meeting, and asked his advisors for something that would stand forever. And Merlin told him of a circle of great stones that stood, already ancient, on a mountain in Ireland. The Giants' Dance, it was called, for giants long ago were said to have carried the stones all the way from Africa and set them up for their healing power, pouring water over them and washing their wounds in it. "Bring those," Merlin told the king. "There are none stronger, and none with such virtue in them." So the king sent an army over the sea to fetch them. And the men got to the mountain and looked at the stones and set to work with all the ropes and the iron and the strength they had, and could not move them, not one. They heaved and they hauled and they broke their tools, and the great stones sat exactly where the giants had left them, as if rooted to the middle of the earth. And then Merlin, in Geoffrey's telling, did not raise a hand or speak a spell or call on any power. He watched the soldiers exhaust themselves, and he laughed, not unkindly, at all that wasted heaving. And then he set up his own engines, his own machinery, his own cleverness, his own quiet understanding of weight and leverage, and how a heavy thing can be persuaded rather than forced. And the stones that a whole army could not shift came down lightly under his hands, and were carried to the ships, and taken over the water, and raised again, in the same pattern, on a plain in Britain. It was, in the oldest version, a story about knowledge, not magic. Not by strength, but by skill, was the whole point of it. The mind outdoing the muscle, the engineer succeeding exactly where the army had failed. The stones came, Geoffrey said, to the open plain we would later call Salisbury, which is to say that this is one of the oldest surviving stories anyone ever told to explain the great standing stones of Stonehenge, and that the story credited them, from the very first, to Merlin's cleverness. The magic came later, as it always does. A century or so on, an English poet named Layman retold the same tale, and could not resist improving it, and gave Merlin the sorcery that the older version had carefully withheld. And so even here, inside a single legend, the whole process can be watched happening in slow motion. The engineer of one century quietly becoming the enchanter of the next, for no reason at all, except that enchantment made the better story, and each teller wanted the better story. The other great deed Geoffrey gave him was darker and quieter, and it is the one that bound Merlin to Arthur forever after. A king named Uther conceived a hopeless, consuming desire for another man's wife, a lady named Igraine, married to a duke, and the duke, seeing it, carried his wife away and shut her up for safety in a castle on the far cliffs of Cornwall, at a place called Tintagel, where the sea came up on 3 sides, and the only path to the gate was a narrow neck of rock a handful of men could hold against an army. It was, by design, unreachable. And Uther, half mad with wanting, turned to Merlin. And Merlin, for reasons the story does not much trouble to justify, used his art to change the king's very face and form and voice into the exact likeness of the duke, the woman's own husband, so that Uther walked up that narrow neck of rock and passed the guards unquestioned, welcomed as the master of the house. Out of that night, in the legend, came Arthur. It was not a comfortable tale, and the old tellers did not pretend that it was. There is a deception at the root of Britain's greatest king, and everyone who told the story knew it. But the effect of it, across the centuries, was to make Merlin the hidden hand behind the whole of the Arthurian world, the one who arranged the strange birth and then took the newborn child away to be raised in secret under another name, and then, years later, set the sword in the stone that only the true king could draw, so that the boy he had hidden could be revealed at the right moment to a doubting kingdom. Whatever Merlin had once been, a mad bard or a fatherless prophet, he was now something else, and something permanent, a maker of kings. The quiet figure standing just at the edge of the throne room, older than everyone, saying little, who already knew how the whole story was going to end. And then, some 100 years after Geoffrey, in France, the story grew a heart and a weakness, and at last, an ending. The great prose romances of the 13th century, enormous, winding books that gathered up every tale of Arthur's court that anyone had ever told, and wove them all into a single vast cloth, took Merlin, the ageless kingmaker who knew everything before it happened, and gave him the one thing every legend seems eventually to want for its wizard: a way to fall. They gave him love. In these later books he loved a young woman, called in some versions Nimue, and in others Viviane. And he taught her his art, all of it, everything he knew, holding nothing back, because he could deny her nothing. And she, having learned the words from the only man who knew them, having gotten from him the whole of his power, used that power on him and closed him up forever. Where exactly she sealed him depends entirely on who was telling it, and each teller chose a different image, and every image is beautiful. In one version it was a cave in the rock, and he lies in it still. In another, it was the living wood of a hawthorn tree in white blossom, grown around him like a hand closing. In another, the strangest and the loveliest, it was a tower of air, a prison with no walls at all, invisible, made of nothing, from which he could see the whole world going by and be seen by no one, and be heard, faintly, by anyone who came close enough to the spot, but from which he could never, ever walk out. He was not killed. That is the strange mercy at the center of it, and perhaps the reason the image has lasted. He was only set aside, alive, aware, still able to speak, still able to be heard by travelers who passed the place. Sleeping, some said, rather than dead, and waiting for something that had not yet come. None of it is in Geoffrey. None of it is anywhere within reach of the mad bard in the northern wood. It arrived 500, 600, 700 years after whatever it was that had begun the whole thing, from writers in another country who had never once set foot in Wales. And it is now, for most of the world, the single truest thing about him. By the end of the Middle Ages, the name had come loose from any one book and from any one country, and it began to do what such names do when they get that large. It settled down onto the land itself. There is a town in the southwest of Wales called, in Welsh, Carmarthen, and in English, Carmarthen. Its name is genuinely old, older than the legend, older than Geoffrey, rooted in the name of a Roman fort that had stood there by the water, a name that means, when you follow it all the way down, only sea fort, and nothing more romantic than that. But once Merlin was loose in the world, people looked at the two names side by side, Myrddin and Carmarthen, and drew the obvious and wrong and lovely conclusion that the town must have been named for the wizard, or the wizard, perhaps, for the town. The scholars will tell you the truth ran the other way, if it ran at all, that the man's name was likely borrowed from the place, and not the place from the man. The people who lived there kept the better story anyway. They will show you, still, where his old oak once stood in the middle of their streets, and what was said would happen to the town if it ever fell. And it did not stop at Carmarthen. Far off on the cliffs at Tintagel, where Geoffrey had set the strange conception of Arthur, there is a deep sea cave in the rock beneath the castle that floods with every tide, and the guidebooks call it Merlin's Cave, and point out the shape of his face said to be worn into the stone, though Geoffrey never mentioned any cave, and the wizard, in the actual story, was never there at all. Across the whole of Britain there are hills he is said to sleep beneath, and springs he is said to have known, and single standing stones that carry his name for reasons no one can any longer recover. Each one of them is a small act of the same very old habit, the habit of taking a name that has grown too large to hold in the mind and pressing it, gently, into the nearest solid piece of the world, a hill or a cave or a stone, so that a thing too big to grasp can at least be visited and pointed at, and stood beside on a quiet afternoon. Of the man himself, if there ever was a single man, almost nothing at all remains. No grave anywhere carries his name. No line of verse survives that we can be sure passed his actual lips. Even the poems that grieve so movingly in his voice were written down long, long after any real Myrddin would have died and turned to earth, set down by later poets faithfully keeping a tradition, so that the very I in them, the I that is afraid of the winter and the hounds, is less a person than a role, a mask that any bard in any generation could take up and wear for the length of a song. Somewhere behind the 14 centuries of accumulated story, there may still be the faint, real warmth of an actual life, a man who loved a particular lord and lost him on a particular grey day at a place called Arfderydd, and could not bear it, and walked away from the whole company of the living into a cold wood, and was never afterward the same. Or there may be no one there at all, only the poem, and the need that made it, and the empty place at the centre where a person is supposed to be. The record is far too thin now, and far too old to ever say which. And yet the name went on without him, and has never once stopped. It went from the mouths of the poets into a monk's careful, untidy Latin, and from that heap into the great confident history that half the Western world took for centuries as plain fact. And from the history into the long French romances that gave him a lover and a cave and an ending. And from the romances out onto the hills and the coves and the streets of the town. And it did not stop there, either. It has been carved into wood, and painted onto walls, and pressed into 1,000 printed pages, and in our own late and busy age, it has been thrown up in coloured light on screens, over and over, for audiences who have never heard of Arfderydd. But the screens are only the newest hands to do the oldest thing, the very same thing people had been doing quietly for 800 years before anyone alive had ever seen a moving picture. Taking a name that had already outlasted its man and giving it, once more, something new to wear. There is a kind of quiet in that, once it settles on you. The wizard that everyone in the world knows was never quite real. The man who may once have been real is almost entirely gone, past all finding. And in the long space between the two of them, in the patient, unhurried work of poets and monks and forgers and dreamers, each one adding a little and passing the whole of it along, a name somehow learned how to live on its own, without a body, without a grave, without a single fact you could set your hand on, for longer than most kingdoms manage to last. It asks nothing of anyone. It teaches no lesson. It is simply there, the way a very old road is there, worn smooth and pale by everyone who has ever walked it, and serenely indifferent now to any one traveller upon it. So there is no ending to give him, in the end, which is strangely fitting, because he was never actually given a death, only a cave, or a tree, or a tower of air, and a long sleep, and the lingering sense that he is somewhere out there still, alive under the hill, listening for the sound of the world. And out past the very last of the story, past the wizard and the king and the stones and the lady, there is only the thing the whole of it grew from, small and cold and quiet. A wood in the north, a long time ago. Apple trees, bare against the sky. A little pig in the dark. A man among them who has finally stopped expecting anyone to come. The battle is over. The Lord is buried. The poets who will one day remember him are not yet born, and the great wizard he will one day become is 500 years and half a world away. And none of it has happened yet. And none of it, tonight, needs to happen at all. There is only the wood, going slowly dark, and the small settling sounds of it, and, somewhere far off and long from now, a name that has not yet even been spoken, beginning, very quietly, its long walk toward us through the years. And that is where I'll leave it. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. If you are still awake, and this one stayed with you, I would be glad to know of it. A review, if you are moved to leave one. A suggestion for a story you would like told. A gentle correction, if I have gotten something wrong. But none of it is for now. It can keep until morning. There is nothing left to do. Let the room stay quiet, and let yourself rest. I will be here when you would like another.